In the summer of 1888, a United States Geological Survey team, led by a field geologist named Walter Roscoe Fenwick, was conducting a systematic measurement survey of Yellowstone's geyser fields when they attempted to sound the vent of a thermal feature in the Norris Geyser Basin that none of the previous survey parties had been able to measure. The feature was not on any of the early maps of the basin. It had been identified by the 1878 Hayden survey team, but had not been given a formal designation because it did not behave like the other thermal features in the basin. It did not erupt on any observable schedule. It did not appear to vent steam, and the water in its opening, when there was water visible at all, was a color that the 1878 survey notes described as unlike the blue of the hot pools or the yellow-brown of the alkaline springs. The 1878 notes describe it as gray. Fenwick's team attempted to lower a weighted line into the vent to determine its depth. The line reached its full extent, 140 feet of braided hemp, without touching bottom. And then, when they attempted to retrieve the line, they found it had changed. Not broken, changed. The weighted end, when it came back up, was coated in a material that none of the four men present had seen before, and the hemp itself in the final 15 feet of line was altered in a way that Fenwick described in his field notes as mineralogically inconsistent with any thermal deposit he had encountered in 2 seasons of Yellowstone survey work. He described what was on the line. He described the color and the texture and the smell. He collected a sample. He sent the sample to Washington. And then, in the portion of the survey record that should contain the analysis of what he sent, there is a gap that has been there since 1889. I came to this through the gap. Gaps in the USG's analytical record from the 1880s and 1890s are not themselves unusual. The survey in that period was understaffed. Its analytical laboratory was inconsistently resourced, and field samples from remote western locations frequently arrived damaged or were given low priority by specialists with more pressing work. I was researching the history of Yellowstone's Geological Survey program for a different purpose when I found Fenwick's field notes in the USG's historical collections at the Denver Federal Center and recognized that the gap in his sample analysis record was not the gap of a sample that had been deprioritized or lost. It was the gap of a sample that had been received, assigned an analysis number, logged into the laboratory intake system, and then not processed through any analytical channel I could find in the existing record. The intake log exists. The analysis number exists. The analysis does not exist. And Fenwick's field notes, which I read in full, are among the most precise and technically thorough field documents I have encountered in a decade of working with USG's historical material, which makes the absence of any follow-up correspondence about his sample one of the most conspicuous silences I have found in any archive. By the time you reach the end of what I am going to tell you, you will understand that what came out of that vent in the Norris Geyser Basin in the summer of 1888 was not a variant of any thermal deposit that the geological science of 1888 had categories for, and that the USG's laboratory in Washington received Fenwick's sample, understood enough of what it was looking at to assign it to a channel outside the standard analytical process, and produced a result that went to a specific senior official and did not come back. What came back to Fenwick was a brief letter from the survey's Washington office acknowledging receipt of his sample and informing him that the analysis had been completed and that the results had been referred to the appropriate division for further review. The letter gave no results. It named no division, and the further review that it implied was apparently the last official communication Fenwick received on the subject of that sample, because his subsequent field correspondence contains no follow-up inquiry about it, and no record of any response that he had received results. Consider what the Norris Geyser Basin was in 1888, because its specific geological character is what makes Fenwick's sample anomalous in a way that a sample from any other part of Yellowstone would not be. Norris is the hottest and most geologically dynamic of Yellowstone's geyser basins, hotter than Old Faithful's basin, more acidic, with surface temperatures that have been recorded at levels lethal to most extremophilic organisms even by modern measurement. The heat at Norris is generated by a magmatic system shallower than the one under most of the park, and the geochemistry of Norris thermal features reflects this. The water chemistry is dominated by sulfuric acid rather than by the carbonate chemistry of the hotter caldera features. The pH in some vent pools drops to values near zero, and the mineral deposits around Norris vents show elemental compositions that differ substantially from deposits elsewhere in the park. Norris is, in short, a place where the chemistry of what comes out of the ground is already unusual by the standards of an unusual park, and where a field geologist would require a specific baseline of familiarity with Norris chemistry to distinguish the genuinely anomalous from the merely extreme. Fenwick had that familiarity. He had worked the Norris Basin for 2 seasons before the 1888 survey. His field notes from 1886 and 1887 describe Norris thermal features with the precision of a man who understood the system's parameters and could identify departures from those parameters without having to calculate them against a reference. He knew what Norris looked and smelled like, what its deposits felt like, what colors the various chemical regimes produced. His 1888 field notes, when they reach the unmapped vent, shift into a comparative register that is the most technically detailed description I have found of any single thermal feature in the entire USG's Yellowstone survey archive. He is not writing vaguely. He is writing like a man who understands he needs to describe something precisely because he will not be able to bring it back in its natural state, and who understands that the sample he is sending is a secondary record, and that his field description is the primary one. He describes the material on the weighted end of the sounding line as having a texture he compares to wax, but denser. He pressed his thumbnail into it, and the impression did not hold, which he notes is inconsistent with any sulfur deposit or siliceous sinter he had encountered in the basin. He describes the color as a blue-gray that he has not seen in any Yellowstone deposit, and that he would be inclined to attribute to some copper compound if the basin's chemistry supported copper mineralization in that form, which his prior work suggests it does not. He describes the smell as absent, which he finds more notable than any smell would have been, because thermal features in the Norris Basin invariably produce sulfur compounds detectable at close range, and the material on the line had no detectable odor whatsoever. No sulfur. At Norris, on material that had come from 140 feet below a Norris vent. And the material on the weighted end of the line is not the only thing Fenwick describes. The altered section of the hemp line itself, the 15 feet of rope immediately above the weighted end, receives its own description in his field notes, and it is, in some ways, more difficult to account for than the material on the weight. He describes the hemp fibers in that section as having changed in texture, not coated, the way rope becomes coated when it passes through a mineral deposit in suspension. Changed. He writes that the fibers in that section of the line have taken on a rigidity that the other sections of the same rope do not show, and that when he bent the affected section against itself, the fibers did not spring back with the elasticity that hemp normally shows. He notes that the rigidity is not uniform along the affected section. It is more pronounced in the final 5 feet, and diminishes gradually toward the unaffected rope above. He notes that the color change in the hemp follows the same gradient, a deepening of the blue-gray toward the weighted end, fading to the rope's natural color over the following 10 feet. He rules out the obvious explanations in sequence, not silicification, which would produce a different texture and a different color, not sulfur crystallization, which would produce a detectable odor, not the effect of extreme heat, because the uncoated sections of the rope show no heat damage, and the temperature at the vent's opening was not extreme by Norris standards. He cannot account for the change in the rope, any more than he can account for the material on the weight. He notes both. He collects both the material and a sample section of the affected rope. He sends both to Washington. Only the material receives even the incomplete acknowledgement of an intake log entry. The sample section of rope is not in the intake log at all. This is the part I keep returning to. Because the absence of a sulfur signature and material from a Norris vent is not the kind of anomaly you get from a variant mineral deposit or from an unusual chemical regime within the known parameters of the basin's geochemistry. The sulfur compounds at Norris are not a trace component of the system's chemistry. They are its dominant output. A material that carries no sulfur signature and comes from 140 feet below an active Norris vent is not a variant of what comes out of Norris vents. It is something else entirely, and Fenwick was experienced enough to know this, and he said so in his field notes in precisely the restrained language of a scientist who understands that his observations will be evaluated by colleagues who were not present and who will require specificity rather than emphasis. There is a second document in the personal papers of George Ferdinand Becker, a USC staff geologist who specialized in the chemistry of volcanic and geothermal systems, and who would have been the most qualified person in the survey's Washington office to analyze Fenwick's sample. There is a letter to his wife dated September of 1888. Becker wrote to his wife regularly while working, and the letters are in the Becker papers at the Library of Congress, in which he describes, briefly and in non-technical language, a sample that has arrived from a Yellowstone field team that is, in his words, outside the classification system he has been using, and that he is not going to be able to process through the standard analytical workflow. He does not give a chemical description. He says only that it is unlike anything from the park he has previously examined, and that he has brought it to the director's attention. The letter to his wife is the only place in Becker's surviving correspondence where this sample appears. There is no laboratory notebook entry. There is no draft analysis. There is no letter to Fenwick from Becker or from the survey addressing the sample's chemistry. There is a letter to the director's office from Becker, filed in the survey's director's correspondence for October 1888, that mentions a Norris Basin sample requiring special handling and requests authorization for what Becker describes as an alternative analytical pathway. The director's response, if there was one, is not in the file. And the alternative analytical pathway is not described. Alternative analytical pathway. In the USG's correspondence of 1888. For a sample of material from a Yellowstone geyser vent, consider what Walter Fenwick did after the summer of 1888, because his subsequent career trajectory tells a story that the gap in the analytical record does not tell directly. He continued with the USGs for 4 more years, working in the Great Basin and in the Rocky Mountain foothills on survey assignments that were competent and unremarkable. He did not return to Yellowstone. He did not request a return to Yellowstone, which is notable because field geologists with strong familiarity with a particular system typically do return to it, and typically request reassignment to it when the option exists. His assignment records for 1889 through 1892 show no requests of any kind related to Yellowstone or to the Norris Basin. He left the survey in 1892, took a position with a mining company in Colorado, and died in Denver in 1917. His professional papers were apparently not preserved, or if they were, I have not been able to locate them. The field notes from 1888 are in the USG's historical collections because they were filed with the survey's standard record system before Fenwick sent his sample, and the survey retained them as part of its operational record regardless of what happened subsequently. The field notes survived because they were institutional property. Everything Fenwick might have kept for himself is gone. The unmapped vent in the Norris Basin that Fenwick sounded in 1888 has not been identified with certainty in the modern registry of Yellowstone thermal features. The Norris Geyser Basin currently has several unmapped or incompletely characterized features in the areas surveyed by the 1878 and 1888 USCS teams, and without Fenwick's precise location coordinates, which are in his field notes, but which use the survey datum of 1888, requiring a correction calculation against the modern datum that I have not been able to complete with confidence. It is not possible for me to say with certainty which present-day feature, if any, corresponds to the one he sounded. What I can say is that none of the thermal features in the Norris Basin that have been formally characterized by the USGs or by the National Park Service's research program have been sounded to a depth greater than their visible dimensions. That is, none of them have been found to extend significantly deeper than the depth implied by their visible opening. The modern instrumentation available for thermal feature characterization is considerably more capable than Fenwick's weighted hemp line. None of it has been applied to the question of what is at the bottom of an unmapped Norris vent that Fenwick's 140-foot line could not reach. This pattern of anomalous sample collection followed by administrative redirection and institutional silence is present in the USG's Yellowstone records at 4 other points between 1880 and 1910. I have found references to 3 other samples from Yellowstone features that were logged into the analytical intake system and never processed through the standard channel, all of them from the Norris Basin. All of them from field geologists with documented prior familiarity with Norris chemistry. The 4th is from a different part of the park and involves a different category of anomaly, not a thermal sample, but a structural observation, and its treatment in the administrative record is identical to Fenwick's. Intake logged, analysis number assigned, standard processing not completed, field geologist not informed of results, return to the relevant area not authorized. 4 other cases. The same administrative pattern, and, in each case, the field geologist who collected the sample continued with the survey for a period of years without returning to the specific site. And in each case, the field geologist's personal papers are either not preserved or have not been located. What was in the Norris Basin in the summer of 1888? At the bottom of an unmapped vent, at a depth greater than 140 feet below the surface of one of the hottest and most acidic geothermal systems in the world, was something that left a blue-gray, odorless, wax-dense material on the last 15 feet of a braided hemp sounding line. That material arrived in Washington in the autumn of 1888. George Ferdinand Becker, the most qualified person in the survey to analyze it, found it outside his classification system and brought it to the director's attention. An alternative analytical pathway was requested. The results of whatever process followed went somewhere that is not in any document I have found. And Walter Fenwick, who spent 2 days at the edge of that vent making the most detailed field observations of his career, spent the 4 remaining years of his USG's career in the Great Basin and the Rocky Mountain foothills, and never went back. What was lost in the autumn of 1888 is not the sample. The sample may still exist somewhere in the survey's physical collections, in a cabinet that the alternative analytical pathway led to, under a catalog number that does not connect to Fenwick's field notes in any finding aid I have been able to search. What was lost is the classification. The system that George Becker used for volcanic and geothermal chemistry, the most comprehensive such system in American science at the time, did not have a category for what he was looking at. And rather than creating a new category, the institution chose an alternative pathway and kept the question inside a channel that the field geologist who asked it could not follow. Fenwick sent his sample and received a letter that named no results and no division. He did not ask again. The vent at Norris is still there, somewhere under the basin, unmapped in the modern registry, as deep as it ever was, as silent as it has always been. If you know someone who has walked the Norris Geyser Basin and stood at the edge of the pools and felt something specific about that place, a quality that the interpretive signs don't account for, a heat that seems to come from deeper than the geology is supposed to reach, share this with them. Walter Fenwick's field notes are in Denver. George Becker's letter to his wife is in Washington. The intake log entry is in the survey's records. The analysis is not. 140 feet of hemp found something at depth that had no sulfur and no classification and no color that belonged to anything the basin was supposed to contain. It came up on the line. It went to Washington. And the letter that came back named no results and no division and told Fenwick nothing at all.